Although many have adored his music for centuries, the German composer Richard Wagner was a difficult man to like, both in his time and in ours. He was a brash and opinionated man who denounced most of the popular music of his time as shallow, pandering junk. Relentlessly critical of commercialism in art, he was at the same time completely irresponsible with his own money, frequently in debt and spending years of his life on the run from creditors. And though his operas show many signs of being inspired by the work of earlier Romantic composers like Felix Mendelssohn and Giacomo Meyerbeer, Wagner arrogantly declared that his compositions were revolutionary, with no precedent in the art of the past. Because of his involvement with radical politics, the authorities in his home state of Saxony hated him. His extreme opinions about art cost him the friendship of many people, including the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. An affair with the wife of one of his admirers destroyed his first marriage. And though he may have hoped that the passage of time would at least grant him the admiration of posterity, that's not the way things turned out. Wagner is arguably more famous among the general public today for his anti-Semitism and general unpleasantness than for any part of his music. So why does anyone still care about Wagner? Because of the music. Underneath all that pompous bloviation about what is and isn't really great art was a gifted composer who strove to live up to the lofty standards he proclaimed. At least 5 of his operas written before 1870 are among the greatest Romantic operas ever written, and the Ring cycle, which dominated his later years, is an incredible and legitimately revolutionary achievement, one that actually makes sense of some of the more outlandish ideas he promoted in his critical writings. To be more specific, the Ring cycle is a powerful expression of one particularly influential idea, which Wagner first discussed in his 1849 essay Art and Revolution, the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art. Now this word Gesamt, or total, isn't just an intensifier, like, whoa, that's a total work of art, man. Wagner used it to mean that this was an artwork which combined multiple forms of art into a unified whole. Really, that it used all the different kinds of art that's performed anyway. In other words, it was an artwork that appealed to as many senses and emotional faculties as possible, making the audience experience it actively with their whole self engaged, rather than just passively enjoying it, which he felt was the response that most operas in his day were going for, especially the really popular ones. His model for this unifying approach was ancient Greece, a culture in which drama was treated as a form of religious devotion, which included the audience, as active listeners if not direct participants. Dramatic action, music, and dance were present in every performance, and all 3 elements had the same goal: make the audience believe in what the actors are saying, or in other words, sell it. Furthermore, ancient Greek drama was always serious and had a point. In tragedies, obviously the point was to explore moral and emotional questions, but even in comedies, the action was grounded in an underlying morality. Plays like The Clouds or Lysistrata were satirical and pointed, not just silly. I mean, there actually is a lot of silly stuff in some of these plays. In The Clouds, you have Socrates flying around in a basket and making fart jokes. I'm not going to claim that Wagner was 100% correct in his interpretation of Greek drama, but this is at least how he thought it should work. And this image of drama as something serious and meaningful to a general audience was the exact opposite of Wagner's most hated form of musical theater, the French tradition of grand opera, which experienced the height of its popularity during his youth. Again, this isn't a completely fair characterization, but to Wagner, mid-19th century French opera was basically the peak of art for money's sake. He hated the way lots of arias would be stuffed into an opera so the singers could show off, and the dances that were included not when the story needed it, but when the audience was in danger of getting bored for a minute. Wagner thought of grand opera as all show and no substance, a big flashy spectacle designed to amuse the audience instead of absorbing them, as he intended to. Think about the way Martin Scorsese has talked about Marvel movies, and you get a pretty good idea of Wagner's opinion of grand opera. And if you consider another frequent criticism of Marvel movies, that they have so many people working on them that any trace of individuality or uniqueness gets stamped out, that was also a big part of Wagner's objection to the works that tended to make it big at the Paris Opera. Grand opera was a big business, and a lot of people were employed to make each opera even before the actors got involved. Look at a classic example like La Favorite, which premiered in December of 1840 and was performed every season at the Paris Opera for the next 50 years. La Favorite was based on an earlier play by Baculard d'Arnaud called Le Comte de Comminges, but it still needed 2 writers, Alphonse Royer and Gustave Vaez, to adapt that text into the libretto for the opera. And then there were additions made by another writer, Eugène Scribe, who acted as a kind of professional fixer to tighten up the script. That's 4 people so far involved in writing the libretto, and none of them are the composer, Gaetano Donizetti, who is the only one in this bunch that's still kind of famous. Wagner thought this was a terrible way to make art. If the composer doesn't have any involvement in writing the script, how can you ensure that the music and the words really work with each other? And how can anyone write a truly meaningful story if it's traditional for one group of people to come up with ideas, or just rip them off from some other opera, and then get professional hacks, which is what Royer and Valles were, essentially, to crank out a script for them in a month or 2. The separation of libretto writing from music writing is practically as old as opera itself, but Wagner didn't agree with it. And true to his principles, he ended up writing his own libretto to go along with the music in every opera he put on the stage, which of course is part of the reason he was much less prolific and less successful than most composers of grand opera. Gaetano Donizetti, for instance, composed about 60 operas that were produced during his lifetime, despite dying at the age of 50. Wagner lived to be almost 70 and managed to produce 13 completed operas and about the same number of unfinished or unproduced works in progress. But then again, as the old Aesop's fable goes, a lion may only produce one cub at a time, but that cub is a lion. Even if Wagner had relatively few commercial successes in his career, and was only kept afloat later on in his life by the support of a hardcore of obsessed fans, including the King of Bavaria, his tenacious stand against commercial trends in opera left a deep impression. He was essentially the first person to advocate what we would now call an auteur approach to drama, the idea of one person doing everything necessary to create a work of art that reflects a single, uncompromising vision, regardless of what appeals to the mainstream or makes money. Not that dissimilar, in fact, to another famous figure of the late 19th century who was infamous for his unusual style and abrasive personality, the painter Vincent van Gogh. Even people who completely disagreed with Wagner found themselves responding to his call for more individuality in the world of the theater. The Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi had much more popular success than Wagner, and often criticized his approach to composition. Yet later in his career, Verdi himself was criticized for being too Wagnerian. The composers of movie soundtracks during Hollywood's golden age seem to have picked up a lot from Wagner's music, particularly in their use of leitmotif, even though most of them were Jewish. However repellent some of his theories about art may have been, this one particular idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk has considerable staying power, and it continues to inspire new works even now. So, you might be asking yourself at this point, what does all this have to do with video games again? Well, if you think back to when I said that the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk is to unify as many different kinds of art as possible in the pursuit of a single grand conception, you have to wonder whether opera is really the best example of this approach that we have, especially in these times when opera is no longer really a popular art form. What is opera made up of? Basically, it's 3 things: words, i.e. the libretto, stage action or blocking, and music. Making these 3 things work together to convey the same idea isn't easy, to be sure, but that's still only 3 ways of making a point. Motion pictures combine all these art forms too, and add one of their own in the form of film editing, which can convey emotion quite effectively just by juxtaposing scenes in a unique or striking way. And then we have video games. I've pointed out in a previous video that games are more likely to feel awkward and wrong than any other kind of art, because they have so many distinct elements which have the potential to clash with each other. Music, visuals, text, display elements like HUDs and menus, and most centrally, gameplay. But if these elements can clash with each other when you don't pay enough attention to them, that implies that if you do pay attention, they can all harmonize with each other. And if you do that, what you've created is a total work of art. And not only that, but one that's more engaging than any opera could possibly be, because the audience participates directly in every performance. Most of us have played at least one game that tells a story with its narration, with environmental details, and with its visual and musical presentation. But now consider the possibilities when a game also uses its more gamey elements in the same way, relying on its difficulty curve, and the way enemies attack, and even the decisions you face as a player to make the same point. This would be a game that truly takes advantage of its existence as a game to make the most fun and engaging experience possible. And what makes this really remarkable as a concept is that most games don't do it. Most successful AAA game releases take the grand opera approach, stuff the game with the most elaborate and mind-blowing content possible, with standard and proven design elements that the average player already likes. And if it all happens to work together, then great, but that's not really the goal. There are so many games where you could remove half of the levels or missions or abilities and barely change the game's underlying message. assuming it even has one. Whether people realize it or not, I think a lot of the affection that people have for Nintendo games over the past several decades has been due to their designers' greater emphasis on coherence and integrity, regardless of their success in other aspects of design. The original Pikmin is a total work of art, in my opinion. So is Super Mario Sunshine and The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. What a lot of people call Nintendo polish, I would argue has as much to do with the way different facets of their games work well together as it does with more objective points like the absence of glitches. But Nintendo has certainly never had a monopoly on total works of art. Actually, the game which I consider to be the standard bearer for this concept in video gaming, which impressed me more than any other with the unified punch of its thematic resonance, wasn't even originally published on a Nintendo console, although the version I'm familiar with came out on the Wii in 2008. It's Clover Studio's epic, Shinto-inspired action-adventure game, Ōkami, first released in 2006 for the PlayStation 2. Now this video is just a foreword, so I'm going to leave most of the actual discussion of it as a game for the main video. But it may help you to understand it better if I start with a little background on where Ōkami came from. Clover Studio, whose name was taken from the English words creativity and lover, was a development team within Capcom overseen by old pro Shinji Mikami and containing many of their brightest and most ambitious creators, most notably producer Atsushi Inaba and director Hideki Kamiya. The team was officially founded in 2004, just after the release of Viewtiful Joe, which is basically a Clover Studios game, in the same way that Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is basically a Studio Ghibli film. That is, it had all the same people working on it, just under a different name. But despite the team's extraordinary passion and creativity, Clover Studios would go on to be one of the shortest-lived and least prolific studios in gaming history. They were disbanded in early 2007, and in the 3 years of their existence, they only put out 5 games, 3 of which were sequels to Viewtiful Joe, and none of those were as successful as the original, by the way. One of the other 2 games was God Hand, a very strange and challenging beat-em-up which critics absolutely shredded on its initial release, especially IGN, which gave it a 3 out of 10. Really. I bet you're surprised to hear that IGN reviewers are even aware of the existence of numbers lower than 7. These are the same people who gave Dead Island an 8 out of 10. I mean, damn. But the other one, and the only game with an unambiguously positive reputation in hindsight that has Clover Studios' name on it, is Ōkami. Critics were actually pretty positive about the game right after it released, so naturally it should come as no surprise that it defied expectations by selling like hot garbage. Seriously, Ōkami was one of those games like Psychonauts that everybody praised and apparently no one actually bought. It did slightly better on the Wii, probably because its central mechanic of painting on the screen was a natural fit for motion controls. But we're talking Baten Kaitos level sales here, not Chrono Cross. Like pretty much all of Clover Studios' games, except the one that technically isn't a Clover Studio game, this was a financial flop. Which is horribly disappointing, because Ōkami isn't just your everyday run-of-the-mill good game. It's arguably the most ambitious project that anyone on its team, especially director and writer Hideki Kamiya, has ever worked on. And it also marked a critical turning point for Kamiya, which saw him move from a strictly directorial role on games like Resident Evil 2 and Devil May Cry to a more general idea guy role which included story and dialogue writing, like in Bayonetta and The Wonderful 101. But neither of these games is crammed with as much story detail and character interaction as Ōkami, nor, I would argue, are their stories anywhere near as good. Kamiya had always been known in the years leading up to the foundation of Clover Studio for his action-first, story-second attitude. Games like Devil May Cry had a story, sure, but it never demanded as much of the player's attention as the super-polished gameplay and visuals did. And after Clover Studio dissolved, he largely went back to that style. Bayonetta has a lot more in common with Devil May Cry than either of them has with Ōkami. This was something truly unique, not just for Clover Studio or even for Capcom, but in the gaming landscape generally. It may take a few pointers from The Legend of Zelda, but other than its own sequel on the DS, there's really nothing in the world that gives you the same feeling when you play it as Ōkami. It's an experience that melds a unique visual style based on Japanese graphic art with a soundtrack that makes use of uniquely Japanese musical modes and instruments, a story woven together from Japanese folktales and ancient myths, and combat and upgrade mechanics designed to make you approach its fictional world with an equal combination of human sympathy and zen-like detachment. In other words, it's a total work of art, a virtual experience which uses every artistic means possible to make you feel something, without any one element standing out as overdeveloped or incongruent. It's an interesting coincidence that Hideki Kamiya wrote and directed Ōkami at almost exactly the same age, 36, that Richard Wagner first used the term Gesamtkunstwerk, just 1 year before he showed the opera world exactly what he was talking about with his medieval masterpiece Lohengrin. Kamiya and Clover Studio weren't nearly as blunt in describing their intentions for Ōkami, but it's not hard to see the extent to which their love for Japanese culture permeated every aspect of it. This game reeks of Japan. And in the video that follows this one, I'll show you exactly how and why it does. See you then!